Greetings, greetings, and welcome to the fifth class of belonging to each other and the planet. I'm going to start with giving a talk. Will people have questions or want to throw something in? Wave your hand around, or just shout out.
I don't see you on the screen. I don't see you on the
Yeah, I don't either.
Okay, you know what? I'm
Okay.
gonna pin myself though. Maybe that'll be a good idea. Or I'll just do it. I'll do speaker view, which means if any of you speak up, you'll get the be in the big picture. And is that all right? Or I could also just pin myself. I think there's a way to do
Go
that.
ahead.
We control it on our end, whether it's speaker view. What you do doesn't it really necessarily impact
Okay,
us.
right. But this is what's being.
The problem is, Bobby. Yeah.
Okay, but this is what's being filmed. So
I don't know how to do that.
Okay.
I don't know how to do that.
All right. So
I think you might need to pin yourself because I'm not seeing you.
I
There,
don't know what that
I
means.
see you now.
No.
Did you just pin yourself? Okay, now you're gone. Well, say something, Bob.
hold on.
Please.
I'm gonna. The
Sorry,
way it is now, whoever's speaking will show up on my screen. So I'm gonna stop the recording while we get. Greetings. This is class 5 of a class called Belonging to Each Other and the Planet. Carol Carlson sent me a fabulous.
I have Nina. I don't have you, Bob.
I can't get this.
What's
There.
happening?
I have Nina. Not
There you
Bob.
are.
Okay, there's
It's
it.
got a low bandwidth, and so he's freezing up. So if anybody makes a sound, it will show you. So
Well, why don't you all mute? Why don't you all mute yourselves, and then when you want to speak, unmute. Or yeah, you're all muted. Okay. Here we go again. Okay. So Carol Carlson sent me a fabulous video, which I encourage her to send on to everyone else. Carol, I don't know if you did. But Carol, I'm just referring to the video that you sent.
And remind me which one it was.
Oh, well, I'm going to refer to it, and that should remind you. I don't actually remember the name of it, but it has a Native American elder speaking in it. And I meant to go back to it because I didn't register the name of the man. But it has a Native American elder who's quite impressive and talks quite a bit, interviewed quite a bit. But the thing he said that just like boom for me was, he says, the problem is you, meaning non-Native Americans, he says, we were born into the garden and you were expelled from it. Let's think about that. We were born into the garden and you were expelled from it. And that just seemed like an incredibly powerful way of summarizing the great mistake. Your great mistake is to think you're doing the act alone. So I'm trying to think of that as our founding story. That founding story tells us that we are not part of the natural world. It's not our real home, and we don't belong there. And so we're exiled and self-exiled. And that exile is exactly what we need to heal. So he says, you can't understand anything about what's going on. There's no point in even talking about what changes to make, as long as you think as long as you're exiled from the garden, as long as you're expelled, as long as you don't get it, that you too were born to the garden. If you can't get there, forget it. Nothing you do is going to be of any use or value. If you don't find, in our language that we've been developing, your belonging. Because that's the place where anything genuine can come from, has to come from. The only place where someplace genuine can come from. But the corollaries of that are interesting. One is that the natural world is not good enough for us. It's not sacred. It's not our real home. It's not where we really belong. The home that would be worthy of us is somewhere else up in the sky, where we maybe go, but not in this life. Oh, if we behave according to whatever somebody says the rules are. So we don't. There's a Jackson Browne song where he says, you better bring your redemption, bring your own redemption when you come to the barricades of heaven where you're from. Better bring your own redemption. It's not someone else's job to say you're okay, to bless you. Bring your own redemption when you come to the barricades of heaven where you're from. That is to say, where you have a genuine belonging, a right to be. Anyway, the natural world is not good enough for us. Our real home is somewhere else. And the other side of that is we're not good enough for the natural world because we got thrown out. We got expelled for our sins, right? We have an original sin that is a fundamental part of who we are. So basically, the world is not sacred and good enough for us, and we are not sacred and good enough for the world. And this reminds a lot. So what you have here, right, is the balance of hubris. The world isn't good enough for us. We have to make it what we want to. We have to build whatever we want to build in spite of nature, right? The hubris of that. And then the shame. Oh, but we're the despoilers of nature. We're the prodigal child. We're the matricidal, self-expelled side. So you've got the hubris and the shame, and neither is belonging. Hubris is to be above, to be too good for the rest of the world, and shame is to be not good enough, and therefore to have no claim to make and no place from which you have standing to be part of and to have a voice in where you think things need to go. So that two sides of the coin, the hubris and the shame, is so fundamental to the Western Christian view. And it reminds me, remember when we talked about child development, an infant, if the world meets them in a loving and nurturing way, the fundamental conclusion, this is way pre-rational, but in deep in the cells, the conclusion is me and the world can get along. And that means the world is okay and I'm okay. And there is at that level of development no distinction. So an infant can't say, I'm really cool, but it's too bad my parents don't have any idea what I need, right? And nor can the kids say, my parents are great, but if I'm miserable, it must be my fault, right? The world and they are one, and either the world and they are good or not. Either me and the world can get along or we can't. And if we can't, the world's bad and I'm good. So both the idea that we're above and too good for the world and the idea that we're below and not good enough for the world, those are both positive and negative forms of narcissism, but they're both in violation of us getting it that we belong and are part of. Now, I think the expulsion story from Eden, which is just one story, but that the expulsion story rests on a deep instinctive yearning for a primal unity with life in the world that we know that we as humans don't quite have in the way that it seems course, we don't know from the inside what other creatures are like, but it does not seem that it seems like for other creatures, they're just doing life and that they're belong. I can't imagine them worrying about whether they belong or whether they're different or above or not part of. But we do. So I think the idea of Eden is the yearning for Eden is a yearning for that primal unity, and the expulsion is a story about our loss, that there's some loss, and that loss took part in some way in the process of becoming human. So there's something about us that gives us the potential to be apart. And there's a yearning in us to be apart, and a sense that there's some kind of a loss that happened. And there's a poem by, hold on a second, I'm gonna screen share. This is a poem by Wendell Berry. That's one of the poems that I think speaks to that yearning. It's called The Peace of Wild Things. The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. Talk about being in the moment, right? I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. And also in the Eden expulsion myth, you'll notice that what our sin was, what got us expelled, was wanting godlike knowledge, wanting knowledge that was not appropriate for us to have, and the knowledge that only God should have. So it's like we got the knowledge, but without whatever guidance a good God would use that knowledge with. So what that amounts to is our sin is hubris. The great vulnerable sin of human beings is hubris. And I think that potential for hubris is the special challenge and the special responsibility of us as a species to bear, to take responsibility for, and to use our special gifts, which are special gifts, to use them in a way that's not seduced by hubris. And there's a long history of myths and cautionary tales, ancient ones, that address that. So like Pandora's box, right? Our curiosity. We opened it up, and the ills got loose. Now, I'm not saying everything that's hard in life is our doing, but the idea that something we did opened up, that was about our wanting to understand, that loosed, I think it's called the ills in that. Or there's a myth of Icarus, right? Wanting to be so close to the sun, being able to, and we don't have wings. Nature didn't give us wings, but we were able to build wings. Wow. And to fly. But if we fly too close to the sun, then the sun melts the wax with which Icarus made the wings with, and you plunge. There's also rites of passage that every native, that every tribe had when we were tribes. And those are all about putting us into alignment with the natural order and the natural cycles of life. A right to, now you're an adult. Now you take on the responsibilities of an adult. Now, whatever. So all the rights that were designed to bring us into an alignment with the cycles of nature, and which involved some kind of a knowing that we needed rights to do that. I don't think animals need rights to do that. I mean, they have, who knows? I won't speak for animals, but that we need to be involved in the cycles of life and to get ourselves attuned to and to understand that we're part of them, and that includes birth and growth and surrender and death and giving our parts back to the world. And that as a species, we seem to need a culture to do that, to know our place. To find our belonging, our rightful place and belonging. And it's interesting, one of the things that's special about human beings, which I'll say a little more about later, is that we develop culture. And I think animals also develop culture on certain levels, and that we've underestimated. Anytime you talk about humans being separate, you're in danger of the fact that there's a whole history of us thinking we're separate that underestimates and fails to understand what animals do. So, but nevertheless, I think it's important to be able to say, what are some of the things that separate us, and that they're not necessarily glorious, they're just ours. And one is, I think that we have the ability to create culture, that is to say, to have knowledge and to pass it on, and to have cultural traditions that pass knowledge on, and that's been part of the ability of humans to progress and to have increasingly power. That someone learned to rub sticks together and make fire, and all these things that people have invented that we depend on in our lives now, that if we had to start from scratch, we wouldn't have a shot. So culture is our great power, and it looks like we need culture. Because we have that power, we need culture. We need a culture to contain and direct and keep positive our abilities. So I think the core of the difference between us and animals, as far as we know, is the capacity to be self-witnessing. To not just be, but to witness ourselves being. To see ourselves being. And that dichotomy to both be and to witness, and how to negotiate that dichotomy, where you're not just witnessing yourself without being immersed in life, and you're not just immersed in life with no ability to be self-critical and to watch the effects of what you're doing. That's I think our special challenge. And Sartre once said that he thought, this is probably also not quite true, but Sartre said that he thought what was special about human consciousness was that we not only see what is, we can see what isn't. That is to say, we can see what could be. We can see potentials. And that's the core of our creativity, because you can look at some sticks and say, wow, that could be an incredible sculpture, or, that's the basis of our creativity. And it's what allows us to be co-creators of reality in a much more active way than animals are. That is to say, that we can create a reality based on and to match our imagination and our plans and our conscious intentions and our goals and our wishes. We can have our own needs and wishes and goals, and we can act on the world in a way to promote those. So an unprecedented ability to shape the world. And so with that power, I think, comes a race between our ability to impact the world and our ability to manage our tendency towards hubris, and our ability to put ourselves back into communion with the whole, to serve the whole, to respect the whole, to put ourselves in a position of gratitude and service to the whole, which is to say, what I've been calling to be good citizens of existence. And this is a little like a developmental process of a child. As the child's abilities grow, the rules of its ability to have rules for behavior grow. So you don't need your 8-month-old to not know how to cross the street, but you do need your 6-year-old to know how to cross the street. And you don't, and you don't. There's this whole process where as you have more responsibility, as you have more power, you need more responsibility. And that's an uneven race sometimes. And that's, a lot of the teenage thing is that it's all about differentiating, and I'm different and I'm whatever else. And those rules have nothing to do with me. And then how do we find a way to have rules and guidance that isn't just an external thing imposed on us, but that is actually serves us to be who we want to be rather than opposes us from being who we want to be. So in some sense, I think you could say that as a species, we're in adolescence because our ability to take responsibility for our actions has not caught up yet with the range, the power of our ability to create change. This is a moment. I'm just wondering. This could be a moment if anything of that needs clarifying or people want to say something about it. We could take a little break here before I go on, or you guys tell me.
Bob, you just said as we have more power, we have more responsibility. What kind of powers?
Well, we can blow up the world with nuclear weapons. We can stop rivers with dams. We can create global warming.
Okay.
We can have wars.
Yeah, we have all those things. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
The book Breeding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmer, who's a PhD naturalist, college professor, also indigenous woman. I don't know if several people have read that book, but she also talks about the myth of the origin study, or the origin, biblical origin, Judeo-Christian origin versus the
Yeah.
American indigenous.
Can you send that to us? That'd be. I'd love to know that.
The book, you mean?
Yeah.
The name of the book?
Yeah.
Sure. Breeding Sweetgrass, and I'll put it in the chat.
Great. All right. So far, I've been talking about characteristics of us as a species, not of our particular culture we're in. Okay. Now, so where we find ourselves is, of course, a blending or a marriage or a relationship between our evolutionary potential and our culture, and whatever of our evolutionary potentials our culture has fed and cultivated, and whatever parts of our evolutionary potential our culture has stifled or let atrophy, or brutally punished, for that matter. So and that's a two-way relationship. There's a tendency in our culture to say, the evolutionary process and that's written in the genetics causes and shapes our culture and our environment. And what that fails, but that's linear, that's one directional. And what that fails to show is that our culture also feeds back to our genetics, both in the sense of epigenetics, which is the question of which of the things that affect which of our genetic potentials actually become manifest, but also actually our fundamental gene structure can be influenced by culture. Just a crude example would be, let's say we're in Alaskan tribe, and the people that are antisocial and that don't know how to behave in a way that's compatible with the needs of the whole get left on the ice floe. You don't want to be with us, fine. See how it goes for you on the ice floe. There's something very attractive about that, I have to say. Thank you for that, Diane. Or Carol, I guess it was. Yeah, so if that was done with sufficient consistency, guess what? Being a jerk would actually not be an evolutionary advantage, and the jerks would, and the people who know how to get along would survive. So it's a loop, it's a feedback, and culture affects our genetics in the same way that genetics affects our culture. It's not a one-way street. It's not determinist. Okay, so I think there's two parts then. So far that we need to do to save ourselves. One is a fearless inventory of our potential for hubris and destruction. And I think, and that's what I've been talking about so far. So far, I've been talking about the species, not the culture. So one is a fearless inventory of our potentials for hubris and destruction, which is to say our Achilles heel. And if you got an Achilles heel, boy, you're a lot better off knowing that you have it. But Achilles heel is not fate. If you have an Achilles heel, I'm sure there's things you can do that would minimize the chance of being shot in it. So that's one. We need to know that. And then two, how do we build a culture that brings forth and nurtures our pro-social, pro-life potentials? Our potential to belong, to be part of, to be a constructive part of creation. How do we build a culture that promotes and supports that rather than promoting and supporting hunger for power and individual aggression and assertion and competition and so forth? So now we're back into the cultural thing and back into the question of the narcissistic paradigm. And I'm saying that the narcissistic paradigm, with its concentration, that because our present current system involves a huge concentration of power and privilege, and that concentration of power and privilege rests on and is justified by an ideology that stresses competition and conflict and a struggle for power and dominance as the organizing principle of nature and society. And we talked about how, a social system projects its values onto nature and then uses that projection of nature to say, so our society is just the way it is. It's just what God or nature demanded of us. So the present system, again, this is a caveat that I should say every fourth sentence. I'm talking about the dominant aspects of the current system, which I'm calling the narcissistic system, that I think we need to be aware of in order to orient ourselves about what we need to do. This is not a full description of everything that goes on, because there are glorious and wonderful human things going on. And some of that is what we've talked about as the birth of the new and the next, but also of the survival of the values of the old that are born of the conflicts and insufficiencies and the broken promises of the given system. So this is not a description of all of our reality, but it is, I think, of the ideological framework that our culture runs on, and that it'd be really good to be conscious of, because otherwise it operates unconsciously on us, even those of us who are not in support of the oppressive aspects of the system. So this present system keeps its power by exploiting the human potential for separateness and for fear for one's own survival and for conflict. And the most powerful tool is what it tells us about human nature. This system claims to be based on human nature and just that, therefore, just the way it is. And so it's telling us who we are, and what we can hope for from ourselves. And that's part of saying everything you don't like, that's just how it is. It's fated. And the point is, it's disempowering of the ability of humans in that system to get together and stand up for change and for a society that's less oppressive and less exploitive and less uneven in its use of resources. Now, the modern creation story, of course, the Christian one is still big, but the dominant modern creation story is evolution. Now, again, this is another disclaimer. This is another very complicated issue, and I'm somewhat caricaturing it, and there's very sophisticated and wonderful work being done by scientists on evolution. But there's also a mainstream aspect of our theory of evolution, and then the way that that's gotten popularly used to justify our system. So basically, so again, crude and simplified, the theory of evolution sort of tells us that we got here by winning a competition for survival. And by passing on those traits that made us winners onto our offspring. Through a process of random mutation and then natural selection. But the summary of that really is in the expression, the survival of the fittest. Now, that is a perfectly fine sentence if you have a sophisticated understanding of what fittest means. But the popular implication of it is the survival of the fittest is essentially the most aggressive, competitive, the winners of the struggle for survival. And what implies for us is that our aggression and our competitive and ruthless tendencies, our natural, our self-aggrandizement, that's the aspects of our nature that we can thank for having scraped out a place for ourselves in existence, for being here. And then we sort of did that against all odds and against nature and against the competition of all the other things in nature that wanted to be and who were competing with us for a place in it. Now you'll notice in that we're back to, now this is not the Eden model, but it shares with it the idea of sort of the dichotomy, the poisonous dichotomy of hubris and shame, right? So either we are, we just won, we're just the winners. Or shame. We just are nasty, competitive creatures. We've destroyed everything else in trying to take the world over. And that's the way we are. So it's still saying that's our fundamental nature that we either need to be arrogant about or ashamed of. Now, the huge blind spots in that version, that's a very simplified, unsophisticated version of evolution, of the mainstream evolutionary theory. What was that? We're recording, yes? Yes, we're recording. Okay. So the blind spot of that is that it neglects the interdependence and cooperation and mutual independence and mutual support that binds everything that exists together and that is the condition of the existence of every separate thing. The web of life that is the unity that makes possible and to which everything that exists has had to weave itself in. And I have to admit, I'm proud of this phrase. This is I want to say, instead of the survival of the fittest, You could call that the survival of that which fits in. The survival of that which has figured out a way to fit in. Now, that doesn't mean that things don't have to assert themselves enough to exist, but they also, right, that's belonging, the two sides of belonging, to stand up for oneself and to be part of. So I want to share an experience I had a time I got this on a level more than I often do. I was out on my back deck, and we have this rich bed of St. John's wort, which is a beautiful scrub about a foot high or so. And in it, in the right time of year, there are these glorious buttery blossoms. And they are just rich, buttery yellow. And they put up a bunch of stamen. So there's a cushion, whole cushion of stamen coming up from each blossom. And they were all around. And then on almost every blossom, there was a black and yellow fat bumblebee bouncing around like on a trampoline. It's going, woo, hoo, 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 hee-haw, woo, and covered with pollen, and just obviously, and drinking nectar, but getting covered with pollen, but just obviously in ecstasy. And what I got from that was that the St. John's wort was saying, hey, this is me. This is what I got. I got these things. Any takers? Anyone interested? And the bumblebee was going like, woohoo, yes, sir. This is fantastic. This is really great. And it's because its offering was accepted by something else in existence, because this blossom, hey, anybody can use this? And the bumblebee says, yeah. And you know what? I'll spread the pollen all around, and that'll help you continue to exist. It's because the offering was accepted that a being gets woven into the web of life. And those things that offer nothing, whose offer is not accepted, drop out of the web of life. So anyway, I just felt like I got that in a particular way when I watched that. So, but it's just plain literally true that if you don't get woven in, you drop out of existence. But here's the point. Contrary to the dominant paradigm, what that means is that our long evolutionary road on this planet, and we would not be here if we hadn't learned something about belonging. We didn't get here without learning something about how to belong, or we would not exist. So the point is, we're not orphans. We're not uninvited guests. We are children of nature just as much as the eagle and the tree and the slime mold and the fungus. And the point is, back to the original thing, we too were born into the garden. We too were born into the garden, and we must not allow anyone to take that away from us. And so our job is to reclaim that belonging. So where that mistake comes out, so I at one point was very much involved in the forest ecology, and this was at Berkeley Graduate School, which was where there's a forestry department, very much influenced, of course, by the forestry industry. And so the dominant picture there was this: there's good trees and there's bad trees. The good trees are the ones we can make money of. The bad trees are the ones that are not commercially useful. Now, since the world is a competition, that means if we can get rid of the bad trees, that's good for the good trees, because now there's more for the good trees. Okay, so we will. Now, what that doesn't see is that a forest is a community, that a forest has known how to be a forest long before we walked the earth. And it just so happens that that the woodpeckers who kill the bugs in the good trees live in the bad trees, or the wasps that kill the certain parasites in the certain insects that attack the good trees live in the bad trees. So it's not true. The basic idea that the less for you, the more for me is okay. And so with that model, then that's where clear cutting comes from. You cut it all down, and then you just plant the good trees because you don't want the bad trees, and you put poison on it because you don't want the shrub. Well, the shrub is what creates the soil, what made it possible for the good trees to go up. And that forest is a community, and these sticks that you put together, all the same age. This is sort of agribusiness, sort of agribusiness forestry. They're all the same age. They're orphans. They're not growing up. They're too close together. They don't have room. They are competing for space, and they create an enormous fire danger. So whereas in a healthy forest, the large trees shade out, they're parents. They shade out, and that means that the young trees that grow up in them have to be spread to find the places where there's enough sun for them to grow up. They also create the soil. So not understanding that it's a community, and that orphan trees are not healthy trees because they are not embedded in a community, has led to some real stupidity, and has led red light now to the huge fire danger that we have from same age, single stand, too close together, too dense trees. And you've seen that. By the way, when you go hiking and you see all these little lodgepole pines all stuck together and too tight and you can hardly see through them, if you look around, you'll find big stumps someplace. Those grew up because the big old trees that would have prevented that from happening were harvested. So on the reading list, there's there's been fantastic work done on this, but it's recent. So you'll see The Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. Susan Simard has some fantastic. Anyway, this is all on the bibliography that I sent out. But Susan Simard has some wonderful writings, but also some wonderful YouTubes. And the book called Underworld by Robert McFarland. There's a chapter in that's about what's come to be called the Wood Wide Web, which is the degree to which the mycelia are part of connecting and webbing together everything that's in the forest. So that's one part, is to not understand in our relationship to nature, if we're in the competitive model of how we understand life. Doesn't mean there's not competition in life, but if we think that's the fundamental principle, when you want to understand life, that's the one, you miss a lot. So then the next thing is, so that's relation to nature. The next thing is relationship to each other. What does that notion of our human nature mean in our relationship to each other? And there has been a lot of wonderful work done by evolutionary biologists to sort of excavate human pro-social instincts from the competitive and individualistic assumptions of mainstream evolutionary theory. And when you read their stuff, man, they're saying stuff that you go, yeah, sure. But they're saying stuff, they have to work really hard because they have to prove it and make it okay, because they're really up against a whole mainstream way of looking at the world that doesn't have this in it, really. So but the point is, they've identified that human pro-social instincts, our ability to cooperate with each other, to pass knowledge on in human culture, is the foundation of our evolutionary success, if by success you mean our spreading around the world. We live in a range of environments, for instance, from the Arctic to the high mountains to the desert, that no other one creature does. And it's because we've developed culture, so we've learned how to live in the Arctic and how to live in the desert and whatever else. So just the spread, even just the geographic spread of human beings that's a way of describing our success. So just our impact on the world. Our success is a result of our ability of our pro-social ability to organize and cooperate with each other and therefore have collective power. And what's important in that is that as social creatures, we have evolved not just to adapt to our natural environment, we have evolved to adapt to our social environment. That is to say, to evolve behaviors that are adapted for the group. So one person, this is also on the reading list, is Nicholas Christakis, who wrote the book called Blueprint. And this is a hard science guy who's finding a way to say it where scientists will buy it. He's looked at what he calls a social suite. He calls it a social suite. He says, we have genetically built in, because it's adaptive, because it's been genetically adaptive for us as a species, we have built in a social suite of pro-social instincts. And this is his list. But the point here is that if we want to be that we're not pro-social in spite of our human nature. It's not that pro-social has to be imposed by laws and rules to make us behave decent, because really we all want to just screw each other. But that we have a genetic and evolutionary potential built-in adaptive pro-social traits. So one is the capacity to have an individual identity and to recognize it in others. To know we are an individual, unique self, and to recognize someone else and say, oh, they're them, that's that person, that's that person. To love our offspring and our partners. To have friendships. To form social networks. To cooperate with each other. To have attachment to a group. To have what he calls mild hierarchy, by which he means an ability to provide leadership and to recognize leadership, to follow leadership. I don't think he's talking there about a brutal, destructive hierarchy. That we are able to follow and a tribal leader, and so mild hierarchy, and then the ability to create culture. And what that means is essentially social learning and teaching. That what a person learns as part of a tribe becomes immortal insofar as it gets passed on and built on over the ages. Now, what that amounts to, that those pro-social instincts are a foundation of our evolutionary success as a group, and that involves the notion of group evolution. Now, Darwin believed in group evolution, but the belief in group evolution has gotten, in mainstream evolutionary science, gotten very weak, because it implies that evolution happens on the individual level. That evolution that what's good for me is a trait that I will then pass on. And so they get very stuck on, how did pro-social behavior get to be, I mean, this to me is so obvious, but all these scientists, how could there be pro-social behavior when for the individual, it's obviously best to be selfish, and wouldn't the selfish individuals pass on more genes to their offspring? And that's what the whole thing you heard about, the selfish gene and all of that. But what that doesn't understand is that evolution happens also on the group level. And those traits that I have that are pro-social and that work for the group are traits which will be our adaptations, which will be positive adaptations, and therefore lead to the survival of people like me, because the group has survived. A group made up of people who are all killing each other and cannot function as a group will not be good for the survival of the genes of the individual. So, but to look at this and to understand group evolution is weirdly enough been radical within the debates within evolutionary people talking about behavioral evolution. And some of that is the individualism and the atomism. It's an important concept, atomism of that intellectual structure. So atomism means that if you want to understand something, you break it down to its parts. And if you understand the parts, then you'll understand the whole. So if we want to understand, how a body works, you break it down to the atoms and, and the chemicals and whatever. And the more you break it down, you will gain it. Then you'll know, then you'll understand it. Well, that is true. That does give you a form and a type of understanding, but it implies a causal relationship of the parts to the whole. So, for instance, atoms make chemicals, make cells, make organs, make organisms, make species, make an ecology. That's a one-directional causation from the parts to the whole. What's missing in that and what's not holistic about that is that the whole also creates the parts. So the ecology affects the species affects the organism is part of what works for the organism is how organs developed, right? And what worked for organisms is how cells happened, and cells from chemicals and chemicals from atoms. So you could do it another way. You could say cells create neurons, create a neural network, create consciousness. Well, yes. But consciousness, the whole has qualities that are not existence in the part. So consciousness can't be reduced to a neural network. A neural network can't be reduced to neurons. Neurons can't be reduced to cells. Cells can't be reduced to chemical reactions. Chemical reactions can't be reduced to atoms. That's because the whole has qualities that are not existent in the part. So wholes also evolve, and wholes also feedback and are part of creating their parts. And the parts that are successful in making up a functioning whole are the parts that survive. Those cells which were able to become or be parts of organisms and be part of species, and that species be part of the environment. Those cells survived, and those that didn't. So that's called emergent. And so again, to summarize, and this is pretty obvious, right? But mainstream science really had to find the word emergence and make this a concept. Emergence is that wholes have properties that their parts do not. That there's a transcendent synergy that happens when the parts come together in a whole. So one obvious way, if you've watched someone die, when they die, let's experience something left. Well, the material is exactly the same. The material is exactly the same. What has happened is, now you can say the soul left, but I think what happened is the relationship between the parts stopped. The parts that are still there stopped being in a holistic relationship that made for a living being. I forget whether it was Watson or Crick, but one of those two guys, these are the greatest scientists of our time. They discovered DNA and the double helix. One of them said, I know there is no soul or life principle or vital principle in human beings. The reason I know is I've taken an electron microscope and I have looked into the cells, and there's nothing there but the material parts. Just a genius, right? So I said that to my son once when he was 11, and my son said, what was he looking for? Little things with an S on them for soul? What did he expect to see? Well, it's because it's not a separate object. It's because it's the relation, the soul, if there's one, in the life, spirit, life is the relationship of the parts, the functioning interaction, relationship of the parts, not the parts themselves. So evolution goes on. It is still going on. And one of the things evolution does is it starts from where it got to, and then in any moment, and then adjusts. So one of the things that happens is a repurposing. So, and one famous example of that, I'm told, they say, is feathers. And looks like feathers were originally created to warm, or they were so beneficial because they warmed the creature. At some point, the feathers were used for flight. Now, at the point when the feathers get used for flight, they have now been they evolved. Their usefulness evolved because someone was using them for flight. So the genetics itself was influenced by the experience of creatures that were beginning to fly. It became adaptive to have feathers, and that means that those birds that had more flight-worthy feathers, that would be an adaptation that would be encouraged by the evolutionary process. Important example, oxytocin is sort of a pleasure hormone, and oxytocin gives a feeling of peace and pleasure. And turns out that oxytocin ended up being released, being released to encourage us to feel pleasure in birth, in attachment, in bonds, those give us pleasure, to support pair bonding is built in, that we get pleasure in pair bonding, father nurturing, friendship, teamship, cooperation. Those things give us pleasure, and we have evolved the things that we've evolved the hormonal system to encourage us to do those things. That's instinctive. That's not because someone said it's nice to be a good team member. So the whole point of this blueprint thing is essentially, you notice those are qualities that are, you think of them as part of, they would be good for tribal people. And for instance, the one of, what was the one that's attachment to the group, right? Now, attachment to the group is obviously a good thing because it makes you care about the other people in the group and want to protect them and defend them if necessary, okay? So the kind of question is, can that social suite, as he calls it, be applied to a larger we? Can our genetic potential to be part of and to join with and to be pro-social in relationship with, can that be expanded to a we that is appropriate to the stretch of our relationships at this point? I'm going to summarize. So we do have an evolved, adaptive, genetic, inborn capacity and guidance to belong and be part of. We need to reclaim and nurture and support those qualities in ourselves and in our society, and build a society that nurtures and promotes those. We also have a human potential for disbelonging and to put ourselves in exile and to be in hubris. And it's important that we be sober about this. And so we need to build a society which nurtures and brings forth our ability to respectfully belong to each other and to nature. And in the case of, like I said, the social suite, can that, which was about adapted for an ancient tribal us, can those qualities be engaged and applied to a larger we? That includes the earth and other humans. And then there's this phrase that I've been promoting. I'm going to say it again, and then that'll be the end of this talk. I've summarized the social suite as that we have an inborn genetic yearning to be a meaningful, respected, empowered, and contributing part of a meaningful whole that is bigger than us and worthy of our allegiance and ultimately sacred. A yearning to be a meaning, so we can have this as a guidance in us, a yearning to be a meaningful, respected, empowered, contributing part of a meaningful whole that is bigger than us and worthy of our allegiance and ultimately sacred. And the question is, can that whole be the species, the planet, and life itself? And that's our challenge. All right. I'm going to change on the camera here the view so we're all got our little boxes. And wow, I took a lot of time there, didn't I? All right. The floor is open. Whoever wants to speak will need to
Still there? I'd love to. There they are. Hey, Lauren and Carol. Good to see your faces.
It occurs to me that each of the times that you have a session with us could be a chapter in a book that I hope you write.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'm hoping it could be, yeah.
Well, one of the things I always do for me, in order to learn, I need to draw. Otherwise, if I just write notes, I lose it. But I don't know if you can see this, but I have, well, you can't see it here, but there's the division between all the different people. But then I did over here, what I came up with is looking at my world, the world out there and what my perception of the world is, and how there's sort of the building blocks of my beliefs and inside and outside my old beliefs, maybe that I haven't examined, my current beliefs, the stories and the values. And so, at our age, most of us probably think we've done lots of that work already. I mean, that's why we're in this group, because we're drawn to that kind of work. But I started thinking again, even though I'm not a religious person, I'm not a person that buys into certain kinds of religious, doctrine, that I'm still wondering. I thought, well, I'm going to go back and again and examine how much that other people's beliefs around me about that we're not part of the earth, but somehow we earn heaven. That if we do the good things, we get the rewards afterwards. How much that still has a great influence on me, even though that's not my dogma. So that was a good reminder to I'm going to do some pondering on. Thank you.
I think people only learn something when they go like, oh yeah, I knew that. But, I knew that, and it's nice to hear someone else say that, So I will normally keep the talks a little shorter because I want a little more time for other stuff. But um,
A
so
good many decades.
go.
Oh, a good many decades ago, my dissertation was, I was in organizational psychology, and I spent quite a bit of time looking at reductionism and its effect on understanding how organizations work
Yeah.
versus more systemic view. And I developed that to quite a bit. And I'm thinking that there's a good bit of similarity in coming to understand the importance of whole systems and the whole idea of systems thinking. So I'm just kind of reconnecting with some of how I looked at what was happening in the work world.
Yeah. That's fascinating how, the efforts to try and bring that into the work world and the challenges of doing
And it
that in a
has,
capitalist system, I think. But yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So we're going to have,
One of the things for a nut.
was that Terry? Go ahead.
Bob, as I listened to you talk about the contrast of bringing in the inborn genetic yearning, meaningful, sacred experience, it sounds like involution, which I don't hear people talk about involution. I hear people talk about evolution, but it seems like involution is the corresponding part of evolution. And involution, if it was defined as grace or source or essence progressively incarnating into form, then it seems like that's what you're talking about. But
Yeah.
is that the idea of involution?
I like that way of talking about it a lot. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. And how do we access that and have it guide and empower us and be manifestations of it, which is, I mean, the most fundamental level of belonging, I guess, would be, to experience ourselves and live as a manifestation of life, grace. What do you say? Grace, source, essence. And I think us being that, one of the things that was most amazing to me when I read, but by the way, so we're going to do a thing on religion and spirituality at one point, and there's some books on the reading list. The reading list is really cool, by the way. Check it out. But when they had the Council of Nicaea, I think it was Nicaea, where they basically decided what the official Christian religion would be, and what of the myriads texts would become part of the official Bible and what wouldn't. They proclaimed that the period of divine inspiration was over, was closed. Can you imagine that? You're saying, by the way, anything that God had to say to humanity, he's already said it, and guess what? He said it to us. So if you want to have a spiritual, have a connection to God or spiritual experience, talk to us. And if you think you're having one of your own, since we know that the divine link, that God has cut us off, essentially, it's the devil. Do not trust yourself. If you think you're talking to God and you're not a bishop or some, part of the system, that's the devil trying to mislead you. So talk about a brutal cutting off of the spiritual experience and wanting to claim it and own it. Whew.
Yeah, I think of how that led to the
Yeah.
witch hunts and the burning
Yeah.
witches,
Yeah.
because they had a source of wisdom that they accumulated that was therefore considered to be the devil's work.
Right.
If they could
Was not
keep
under
it
control of, my God, a bunch of women having spiritual experiences. Can you imagine? Whew, makes the blood run cold.
dirty.
Well, we don't have time for much of, the experiential. What if I suggested a homework? And maybe I'll do a little bit. I've pretty much done the same sort of invocation. I'll do that. And then the homework will be however you do it, but then my little invocation is one path to it. However you find your connection to the aliveness in you, to the spirit in you, to life in you, however you find it, go someplace beautiful, and just pay exquisite attention and see if there's a movement that wants to happen. If you really we're tuned in to that energy from the source that's cooking in you, or that's coming to you, and maybe as a powerful force, and maybe as a subtle little quiet thing. But however it is, if you were to let it move you, and you're not worrying about being beautiful or ugly or having a witness or whether it's graceful, none of that. It's just, what if the movement were to move me? And what I'm doing in my body is simply an expression and a manifestation of the life force in me at this moment. What would that be like? And you'll catch yourself at one point saying, "Oh, I'm raising my hand," or "Oh, I'm doing a plie," or whatever. And that's fine when you notice that. But can you go back from your familiar movements that you may have? Not that those are great, but can you go back to those? Can you let go of that and find actually where at this unique moment the life energy in you wants your body to move? And you can do that as long or as short as you want to, And of course, your movements will have a vocabulary. If you do qigong or karate or anything else, you will have a movement vocabulary, and that's fine. You can inhabit that and do that with great consciousness or mechanically, depends. But in this, you're really looking for that fine edge where your ideas of yourself, or your ideas, or your will, or your categories, or whatever, are not what's controlling the movement, but it's happening. And so I'm going to suggest messing with that. And maybe I'll just end it with the basic thing we've been doing. So get comfortable. Is there anything else that needs to be said or happen? Or can we just end with this and then we'll close?
I have to leave.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Karen. Thanks for your contribution, Karen. Appreciate it. Okay. So, no, we have 3 minutes. Wow. Okay. Well, we said quick and dirty. You don't have to walk through the desert on your knees. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. So just get comfortable and probably close your eyes. Sense in to yourself and pay fine attention to everything that's going on in your body that lets you know that you are not a marble statue of yourself, but a living, breathing creature. And notice how you experience that in yourself. It may be subtle and quiet. It may be a raging storm. It may be throughout your body. It may be in some particular part of your body. It may be something you could categorize as a pain or a discomfort. But whatever it is, it's how your aliveness is manifesting in you right here in this moment. And that's because you are a living organism. And nature is in you as well as it is outside you. Nature lives as a campfire in the mitochondria of every cell of your body. That every cell of your body is serviced by trickles and streams and rivers of blood that bring each campfire what it needs. It takes away what it needs to get rid of. That there are storms of hormones that blow through your body and reach every corner of it. There's an infinitely fine electrical network of neurons that reach every possible corner of your body and through which currents and streams and messages and knowledge and experience flows. That behind all that, there is the constant drumbeat of your heart, like a drum in the jungle, and the rhythm of your breathing, of your taking in from the world and giving back to the world of your breath. That is the constant background of your existence on this world. And I'm going to say goodbye and wish you all a deep bath in your existence. And I look forward to seeing you next time.